To find the physical record of the German past, you rarely start in a museum. You walk into the damp, quiet wilderness of the local forest. A hiker could easily trip over a moss-covered rock or push past a strange mound of earth, completely unaware they are standing directly in the center of an ancient military footprint. We view these fragmented walls today as quiet, romantic landmarks, but in their prime, they were loud, highly organized, and brutal centers of absolute authority. These buildings functioned as calculated military chokeholds. By anchoring a fortress into the narrowest point of a valley, a local ruler locks into a strategic bottleneck, dictating exactly who and what is allowed to pass. That single geographic advantage allowed them to dominate long-distance trade routes, manage every ship on the river, and extract taxes from every village within sight. These structures were engineered to be permanent, invincible fixtures of power. Today, the stones intended to signify eternity are being slowly digested by the soil. A fortress operates like a massive organism, and its death is rarely a sudden, violent event. Instead of falling to fire or siege, most castles endure a slow, centuries-long decline. The decay begins when the building loses its purpose. Evolving artillery technology eventually made high stone walls vulnerable, and shifting political alliances often neutralized the need for defense entirely. As redrawn borders moved, a frontier outpost could find itself deep inside friendly territory, stripped of strategic value. Without military need, maintenance became impossible. Families abandoned these stone halls for modern palaces, leaving thousands of fortresses to the elements. The moment the last human stops patching the roof, the castle loses its only defense against its most patient conqueror, nature. The biological siege begins with an invisible entry. Rainwater lands on the masonry and seeps into the microscopic pores and tiny cracks of the stone surface. When trapped water freezes, it becomes a mechanical wedge. The ice, expanding violently, inside forces heavy stone blocks apart from within. Seeds blow into these fresh, damp fissures and take root. As they grow, these plants act like organic crowbars, steadily prying architecture away from its foundation. Microscopic wedging eventually cascades into total failure. Timber roofs rot and collapse, walls buckle, and entire towers crumble into heaps of rubble claimed by the forest. The soldiers who originally patrolled these ramparts lived in what they believed was a permanent world. They could not conceive of their impenetrable stronghold being dismantled by freezing raindrops and creeping roots. Standing before a fragmented ruin, the eye instinctively tries to complete the picture. The jagged edges of crumbling brick draw attention to the negative space, the exact volume of history that has vanished into the sky. It takes effort to imagine the forgotten people for whom this military machine was simply home. They had families, enemies, and daily anxieties, yet their names have disappeared along with the ceilings. Modern buildings and human lifespans feel incredibly brief when measured against these surviving walls. These structures have already outlasted dozens of generations. Yet even stone is not immortal. Eventually, the weathering will finish its work, the final archway will collapse into the soil, and the physical memory of the castle will be erased. Until that day, as long as a single stone remains visible above the moss, it acts as a silent connection to a world we can no longer reach. The forest is full of these connections, waiting to be found. We tend to view the medieval castle through a filter of romantic legends, noble knights, fog-shrouded towers, and fairy tales. Strip away the myth, and the reality is a calculated instrument of territorial dominance. These were tools used to project military force and enforce economic control over the surrounding landscape. This broken masonry contains the physical record of how that authority functioned. Every scar and structural failure reveals its operational history. A missing wall, a steep drop-off, or an overgrown foundation reveals the castle's original logic, how it moved, how it ate, and how it defended itself. These ruins are the blueprint of a vanished political system. By examining the physical placement of these stones, we can see the mechanics of power that once dominated this valley. This fortress is anchored to the highest peak, a strategic necessity. Geography was integrated into the defense, placing walls above sheer drops that made ground assaults impossible. From here, a small garrison commanded sightlines over plains, rivers, and roads. As this map illustrates, merchants and supply wagons were naturally funneled into geographic choke points at the base of the hill. By controlling that specific patch of ground, the lord of the castle controlled the flow of goods and the collection of taxes. For a merchant, evading these guarded routes meant hauling cargo through an unforgiving wilderness, an effort that was often geographically impossible. The castle served two masters, a military garrison for defense and a financial station for revenue. Moving past the perimeter walls brings us to the mechanics of daily survival. A dried-up well or the remains of a hearth revealed the intense logistical effort required to keep the structure operational. This period woodcut shows a crowded, active microcity requiring a constant workforce of cooks, blacksmiths, and laborers. Physical conditions were harsh. Thick stone offered little insulation against freezing winters, and the air was heavy with wood smoke from central fires like this one. Because the castle was built on a height, thousands of gallons of water had to be hauled upward by hand. Simultaneously, the waste of hundreds of people and animals had to be manually carried out and expelled from the site. In these cramped, poorly ventilated quarters, an outbreak of disease was a threat as significant as an invading army. The interior was not a comfortable residence. It was a labor-intensive survival engine designed to support the garrison's military and economic functions. These structures were tied to a volatile political landscape. A fortress could serve as a secure regional headquarters for decades, only to become a primary target the moment a local alliance collapsed. Eventually, gunpowder changed the equation. A heavy iron cannonball could reduce a century-old masonry wall to dust and shrapnel in seconds. Once mobile artillery became common on the battlefield, the safety provided by static stone walls on high peaks vanished. This Renaissance palace illustrates a shift in how the ruling class lived. They moved towards sprawling glass windows and accessible flat ground. Manicured gardens and fountains replaced drawbridges, prioritizing the display of wealth over the grim requirements of a siege. The old fortresses were slowly abandoned. Without maintenance, roofs leaked, windows shattered, and the surrounding forests began to reclaim the stone. The ruling families left behind faint traces in the masonry, faded coats of arms, structural repairs, and hidden mason's marks, like this geometric arrow carved into the block. The political power that built these towers eventually evaporated, leaving the masonry behind as a physical record of a system that outlived its own defenses. Look down at the Rhine Valley on a quiet autumn afternoon. It's easy to see why this feels lifted straight out of a fairy tale. You have the wide river drifting calmly through the hills. You have steep, terraced vineyards climbing up the banks, and, perched high on the cliffs, the crumbling stone walls of ancient castles. But to a merchant sailing a cargo ship down this water 600 years ago, this view was threatening. The serene, romantic landscape we see today is a historical illusion, masking a reality that was vastly less peaceful. We currently treat these castles as scenic backdrops for river cruises, a perspective that ignores their original design as cutthroat political machines. During the Middle Ages, the Rhine functioned as Europe's most vital and heavily contested economic supply chain. To understand the true story of the Rhine, we must strip away the romance and analyze the landscape as a theater of military power and economic survival. Before modern road networks, the river was the singular, efficient artery for moving valuable goods across the continent. In this era, whoever exerted influence over this water route effectively monopolized regional wealth and trade. These stone fortresses operated as infrastructural nodes, militarized surveillance towers built to monitor and control every single vessel moving through the valley. Their placement on high rocky cliffs was a highly calculated engineering decision, designed to dominate sightlines and physically throttle the supply chain. For a medieval merchant ship navigating this route with valuable cargo, the journey was harrowing. Every few miles meant encountering a different ruling family, each imposing competing political demands and extracting mandatory tariffs. A single boat ride meant running a gauntlet of militarized toll booths designed to intimidate and extract wealth. Eventually, wars, shifting political alliances, and the introduction of heavy gunpowder artillery rendered these strongholds obsolete. While the power these castles projected was absolute in its time, it was fragile and temporary. Once mighty nodes of control were abandoned, left to decay into neglected ruins. Then, in the 19th century, a wave of painters, poets, and travelers arrived, fundamentally altering the river's legacy. These artists deliberately stripped away the history of economic extortion, painting the ruins as symbols of mystery and national identity. The romantic Rhine we consume today is the result of a successful 19th century artistic PR campaign that painted over a medieval crime scene. Returning to the present day reveals a stark contrast between ancient stone and modern infrastructure. On the valley floor, modern life moves at high velocity, with passenger trains speeding directly past the foundations of ancient watchtowers. The river remains a massive industrial artery, though it is now navigated by steel barges transporting hundreds of shipping containers at once. This creates a unique visual environment, extreme modern speed down in the valley, watched over by absolute patient stillness on the mountains. These historical places provide us with an entirely different metric for measuring time. A human thinks in years. A family might think in generations. A castle, however, thinks in centuries, silently witnessing the slow rise and the inevitable fall of entire eras. This endurance connects back to the river itself, which flowed here long before the first stone was laid and will continue after the modern cities are gone. By existing in the same frame as our modern world, these ruins act as tangible anchors. They make a history that occurred 500 years ago feel visible and reachable in our own time. You can walk for miles through these woods and almost miss them. Hidden beneath the ferns are a few moss-covered stone blocks, the only remaining footprint of a massive medieval castle. Our instincts tell us a structure this size must have ended in fire. We imagine chaotic nighttime sieges, walls shattering under heavy bombardment, and the sudden, violent collapse of a kingdom. In reality, siege engines and fire rarely played a part. Most of these forest forms were never conquered by an army. They were simply outlived by the landscape. This raises a difficult question. If there was no war and no sudden disaster, how does a monolithic stone fortress completely vanish? These strongholds are dismantled by a process much quieter than battle, a slow withdrawal of human energy, leaving the stone vulnerable to a different siege. The end begins with small, practical decisions. A trade route moves a few miles away, a local economy shifts, or a family simply decides that a modern wooden house in the valley is warmer than a drafty stone hall. Architecture dies through inaction. Usually, it starts when a single, difficult-to-heat room is closed off and forgotten. Neglect spreads like a contagion. A loose stone falls from the outer wall and is left where it landed. A small leak opens in the roof, and the occupants simply move their furniture to a drier corner rather than climbing up to fix the shingles. Eventually, the remaining residents pack their belongings and walk away. They leave behind a fully intact fortress that is now completely undefended against the elements. This withdrawal of human maintenance creates a vacuum, and nature is remarkably efficient at filling it. The exact moment the maintenance stops, the biological reclamation begins. Moisture pools on the cold stone, creating a microclimate for moss spores to colonize. Decaying plants form soil in the joints, allowing weeds to take root and dissolve the mortar. Over decades, tree roots act as slow-motion crowbars, fracturing the solid masonry. This relentless expansion eventually brings the walls down, allowing the forest to slowly pull the stones into the soil. A few centuries of root growth and freezing water are far more effective at dismantling heavy infrastructure than any medieval cannon. Modern visitors only see the aftermath of this erasure, a random ditch or a foundation hidden under a layer of dirt. The human brain struggles with this kind of emptiness. Encountering a site where a massive structure once stood and finding only silence is disorienting. So we instinctively fill the gaps with legends of ghosts, cursed nights, and secret tunnels. These stories allow us to populate the void, replacing the uncomfortable silence of a deleted history with a narrative we can understand. Archaeologists must look past these legends to find the real structure hidden in the earth. They map the site by looking for the requirements of survival, the location of the well, the heat-scorched earth of the baking ovens, and the drainage for the stables. Instead of finding chests of gold, they unearth pottery shards and discarded tools, the actual remains of a working community. These domestic traces explain the logistics of daily life, providing a clearer picture of the castle's history than any list of royal battles. Within these vanished walls, people spent their lives tending to horses, writing letters, and baking bread. They lived through the slow passage of years, far from the reach of the history books. Because these acts were so ordinary, they left behind no grand plaques or statues. While we typically associate ruins with kings and conquerors, the stones themselves belong to the laborers and stable hands who actually lived here. History is shaped by this slow, quiet passage of time, the sum of millions of forgotten lives that now rest beneath the roots of the forest. When we look at a shattered stone wall or a collapsed keep, our minds naturally jump to the dramatic. We picture a fiery siege, thundering cannons, or sudden battles that brought the fortress down. But the death of a castle is rarely that loud. Instead, it's a quiet process of decay, one that takes decades, sometimes centuries, to finish. It starts with a loss of function. A stone building can stand for a long time, but only if it serves a purpose that makes it worth maintaining. As long as people need the space, they act as an active shield against the elements. They patch the slate roofs, replace broken windows, and dig trenches to divert rainwater away from the foundation. The moment of ruin doesn't happen when a wall falls. It happens the day the last caretaker walks out the door and routine maintenance stops. Without human intervention, the castle loses its defenses. It is no longer a fortress repelling armies. It is an abandoned shell, exposed to a microscopic invasion. Once the caretakers are gone, the primary threat to the building arrives in the form of rain. Rainwater naturally pools and flows down the masonry, finding the tiniest imperfections, the microscopic cracks in the mortar and the stone itself, and slips inside. When temperatures drop below freezing, water trapped inside fissures turns to ice. Expanding by 9%, it exerts outward pressure, forcing the crack apart. After successive winters, these microscopic fissures widen into deep fractures. The stone is broken apart from the inside. These new fractures provide footholds for opportunistic moss and invasive plant roots, which dig in and pry the masonry further apart, while sun and wind wear down the exterior. Nature dismantles the castle's structural integrity. It is a slow, quiet process that prepares the building for a failure. Decades of this decay eventually culminate in a single failure. The neglected roof finally snaps and caves in. Once the roof is gone, the interior of the castle loses its shield. Now, rain pours directly into the rooms and pools on the wooden floors below. Looking at the structural skeleton, the interior's vulnerability is clear. Vital load-bearing beams and floors are wooden. Exposed to constant moisture, they decay and rot. These beams didn't just hold floors, they anchored exterior walls. Without internal bracing, heavy vertical walls buckle and fall. Over the following decades, the physical space transforms. A carved window becomes an empty hole. The vaulted ceiling is replaced by the open sky. What was once an inhabited room is now a pocket of empty air. With its internal structure destroyed, the architecture ceases to be a machine for living. It settles into the earth and becomes a passive feature of the landscape. Centuries pass. The collapsed stones gather soil, seeds take root, and the ruined building reaches a quiet equilibrium with the surrounding forest. Then humans return. Historians, conservationists, and tourists stumble upon the overgrown masonry, clearing away the brush to study the historical significance of the site. This rediscovery introduces a dilemma for modern preservationists. Should the structure be left as it is, or should we gather new stone and attempt to rebuild it to its original state? A pristine restoration might show us how a building looked on the day it was finished, but in doing so, it erases the history of its aging, creating an artificial version of the past. A ruin, by contrast, wears its history in plain sight. It physically proves that populations shift, that fortresses decay, and that human power is temporary. It doesn't try to recreate a lost era. Instead, it stands as the most honest form of architecture, proof that every structure eventually yields to time.
Medieval history is often presented through the narrow lens of steel and heavy plate, the high-drama world of knights drawing swords for battle. These violent encounters were the rare exceptions of castle life. The vast majority of an inhabitant's time was spent solving the mundane problems of staying alive. Strip away the banners and the armor, and you are left with the physical reality of the structure, a massive, isolated shell of dead stone. Stone provides no natural insulation. It contains no calories, and it yields no fresh water. To function in a hostile landscape, the castle had to operate as a self-contained life support engine, engineered to provide everything the community needed to survive behind locked gates. A siege could instantly transform a castle into an island, severing all contact with the outside world for months. Survival during these periods relied on massive stockpiles of grain, salted meat, and dried goods, all prepared and stored years in advance. While food was critical, the entire system had a more immediate point of failure: the water supply. Because armies could easily poison external streams, an internal underground cistern was required. Architects designed the castle's footprint to act as a collector, funneling rainwater from the roofs and courtyards down into these central storage chambers. Since the human body fails within days without hydration, the capacity of these tanks set a hard physical limit on how long a defense could last before surrender became inevitable. Beyond the need for water, the inhabitants faced a constant struggle against the internal climate, particularly the damp, penetrating cold of winter. The thick stone walls built to deflect projectiles also absorb and hold the freezing outdoor temperatures, creating a permanent chill inside the living quarters. Counteracting this required the maintenance of massive indoor hearths that had to burn day and night to produce any noticeable warmth. These fires created a secondary engineering hurdle, drafting the smoke through narrow stone chimneys to prevent the air from becoming toxic in the enclosed rooms. Achieving a tolerable temperature was a continuous, labor-intensive battle against the very architecture that kept the inhabitants safe from attack. The castle's physical systems, the cisterns, the kitchens, and the hearths, all required a massive input of human energy to remain operational. This required a specialized workforce of cooks, craftsmen, farmers, and stable hands, all working in coordination to keep the engine running. History records the name of the one lord who owned the castle, but his lifestyle was supported by dozens of laborers whose names have been lost to time. Every system required to sustain life, from hauling water to repairing storm-damaged masonry, depended on the constant, grueling physical exertion of this workforce. If this labor stopped for even a few days, the fortress would quickly become an uninhabitable stone tomb. We live in an era of immediate resources, where water, heat, and communication are available at the touch of a button. In a castle, every basic necessity required manual effort, such as hauling water by hand or relying on messengers to carry news long distances. Life was defined by narrow margins. Untreated illnesses were often fatal, and a damaged roof meant weeks of exposure to the elements before it could be mended. The true marvel of the medieval castle is found in the collective endurance of the people who kept its systems running. Their everyday lives were a relentless cycle of labor, performed within the walls of a machine designed for survival. There is a very specific feeling you get walking through a ruined stone corridor. The air is damp, the shadows stretch a little too far, and you immediately feel like you've stepped out of the modern world. This is exactly the kind of space where our minds expect to find hidden vaults, doomed romances, and phantom knights standing watch over forgotten gold. But why do these specific buildings trigger that reaction? Why do we instinctively project so much mythology onto an old pile of stones? This impulse suggests that when we encounter a space stripped of its context, we feel a natural urge to provide our own. Look at a shattered wall framing nothing but the sky. Without a roof or adjoining rooms, we have absolutely no context for what the space actually was. We find a worn stone staircase, completely overgrown, leading nowhere. The physical structure is incomplete. Because the architecture leaves us hanging in uncertainty, our imagination naturally steps in to finish the floor plan. These missing structures are the direct result of a relentless, violent process. Castles were built specifically for conflict. That means their original defenses were regularly shattered by sieges and the steady advancement of artillery. Fire was just as effective. Once the wooden roofs and internal support beams burned away, the entire context of the interior layout vanished with the smoke. Other times, the erasure was perfectly quiet. As national borders expanded and military tactics evolved, many fortresses simply lost their strategic value and were left behind to rot. Over centuries, this cycle of artillery fire, structural fire, and slow decay systematically erased the original factual record of these sites. Even surviving structures didn't stay frozen. They were patched and expanded, creating stacked layers of different architectural eras. The heavy masonry of a 12th century stronghold was frequently overwritten by the tastes of whoever moved in centuries later. What started as a grim military checkpoint could eventually be transformed into a bright residential estate, with ornate metal balconies that serve no defensive purpose. Even today, modern conservation efforts add yet another layer of fresh mortar and historical interpretation to the timeline. Every repair and renovation scrambled the site's original purpose just a little bit more. It's this confusing, multi-layered history that gives modern myths the room they need to grow. Those myths are entertaining, but treating them as history obscures something much more compelling: the people who actually stood on these walls. A garrison commander in the 1400s wasn't losing sleep over a cursed staircase or a wandering spirit. They were terrified of the harvest failing. They were dreading the arrival of winter, the spread of disease through tight quarters, and the very real possibility of a neighboring army arriving at the gates. Above all, they lived with the constant, grinding anxiety of losing their family members to an unforgiving era. These fears lack the cinematic flair of a ghost story, but they are raw, relatable, and deeply human. The next time you walk through a ruined courtyard, you don't have to choose between the facts and the fiction. You can look at both. These stories illustrate how we try to piece together a fragmented past, using imagination to bridge the gaps in the stone. But we also have to recognize the massive, unyielding physical reality of the men and women who carved out an existence here. That is where a ruin truly comes alive. It's a physical space where ancient masonry meets modern imagination, creating a bridge straight back to our shared history.
We live in an era defined by velocity. Within a single human lifetime, entire city blocks are constructed, occupied, and ultimately torn down to make way for the next iteration of concrete and steel. We measure our progress in the rapid turnover of technology and the constant redrawing of our city grids. The environment we build around ourselves is distinctly temporary. Yet, looking down from the hills above these sprawling cities, you'll often find the direct opposite of this modern chaos: a silent, static structure, watching centuries of frantic human activity unfold from above. The people who built these fortifications are long gone. All they left behind is fragmented evidence: a partial wall, a weathered family crest, or a lone stone tower. It forces a question. In a society so fixated on immediate utility and constant upgrades, what actual value does a decaying, incomplete pile of rocks hold for us today? The answer lies in its stubbornness. By refusing to change, a ruin offers an anchor, forcing us to confront a timeline much larger than our own lives. History doesn't actually require a pristine, fully intact building to survive. Sometimes a single, heavily weathered stone is enough to carry the memory of an entire era. These fragments introduce us to the reality of deep time. The walls we see standing today have outlasted not just individual human lives, but the lifespan of entire families and ruling dynasties. These historical maps show Germany's territorial boundaries across 4 time periods. They reveal how frequently borders shifted as empires rose, fractured, and fell. While states were born and erased, the physical stone footprint of the castles remained exactly where it was laid. These walls document the movement of power across the landscape. They stand as physical markers of where authority once rested, outlasting every flag that flew over them. Stand in an abandoned courtyard today, and the sensory reality is striking. The noise of human ownership is gone, replaced entirely by the sound of wind through broken windows and the movement of wildlife. These structures belong completely to history now, and increasingly to the slow, relentless reclamation of the natural world. Roots widen the cracks, and moss covers the stone. But there is a threshold to how long they can survive this decay. The physical architecture retains its meaning only as long as someone from the present makes the journey, stands before the stone, and actively asks what happened there. When living memory fails, countering physical decay requires deliberate intellectual labor. We must scour remaining documents and reconstruct missing pieces of the timeline. Recovering the specific names and dates from these pages ensures the site's human history isn't lost to the silence of the ruins.
To truly understand these places, we have to project invisible human lives back into the empty space. We have to look past the macro politics and focus on the daily routines of survival. Imagine a guard standing watch at the gate in winter, children playing in the hall, or the sudden scent of wood smoke drifting from a chimney. And then consider the sudden finality of it all. There was a precise, entirely unrecorded moment, centuries ago, when someone walked out through that castle gate and closed the heavy wooden door behind them for the very last time. Pull back from that single door, and you realize the true scale of what remains. Germany is blanketed with hundreds of these silent waiting places, watching modern ships passing through the valleys. Some are hidden deep inside dense forests, while others sit high on rocky mountain peaks, offering a stark contrast to the bustling, hyper-connected cities that have grown up at their feet. Forgotten places contain their own density of experience. They wait in the woods as silent keepers of stories, holding on to a past that only speaks when we choose to listen.